Archaeology porn.
Hey everyone, so welcome to the next edition of Archaeology Porn. And today's going to be an interesting one because we're looking at the really old stuff. Now, what do I mean? We're talking about paleoarchaeology. Now, this gets a little bit confusing. So, what is paleoarchaeology? Paleoarchaeology is the study of the human past through the physical remains, material remains, as you know, of ancient hominins up until about 10,000 years ago. Now, why that's confusing is there's a whole bunch of other disciplines. There's paleontology, which is that same time period, but that's the study of ancient life. And I guess life includes humans, but it's or hominins, but it's other types of life forms also. And then there's paleoanthropology, which is the study of human culture and society, but in these same ancient times. Now, because people at this time and hominins, which is not only Homo sapiens, we'll get into that in a moment, didn't have any writing or obviously elaborate culture, the only thing you do find are the remains, the bodies occasionally, and some really rudimentary stone tools and maybe carved things. So in this context, I don't really get what the difference is between paleoarchaeology, paleoanthropology. It sounds all like the same thing to me, but somebody fact check me on that. Anyway, let's first start by defining what is a hominin, because I used that word. And to do this, we're going to have to go back way back to high school biology. And this is to the system called binomial nomenclature, which is the system of giving scientific names and classifications to living organisms. So the way that you do that is there's successively smaller categories. It's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Now, there is a fun way to remember that. I think it's like King Philip can't order fries, something, something. I don't remember. But anyway, I just gave it to you there. Now, so what is hominin? So we humans, like our monkey friends, are all in the same order, which is primates. So we're all primates. Now, below that order, there are several families. Okay, so there's gorillas, there's pans, as in chimpanzee, and then there's one called Hominidae, which sounds like a neighborhood in Seoul. But anyway, that's the one that we're in, Hominidae, which is our family. Now, there are some subgroupings like subfamilies, and below that, there's another subgrouping called tribe. Okay, so hominin is the tribe that Homo sapiens, us human beings, are in. And by the way, binomial nomenclature is the genus and the species. That's the scientific name for any species. That's why we're Homo sapien. Our genus is Homo, species is sapien, tribe is hominin, etc., etc. So this tribe, hominin, is what paleoarchaeologists study. So it's not only Homo sapiens, because it goes way back. If you remember from some edition of Archaeology News, I talked about those carpenters, which were something like 200,000 years old. That's another kind of hominin that a paleoarchaeologist would study. So yes, that does mean there are plenty of other hominins around, other homos around, and you probably heard of some of them. Neanderthals, I forget what the scientific name of them is. There's Homo habilis, Homo erectus. So those are some of the other members of our little tribe here. But we Homo sapiens have the distinction of probably being the only kind of hominin that was around when there were none others around. There's none other around today. So we are the ultimate survivors.
The winner of the first survivor competition is Rich. Congratulations, Rich.
Anyway, so the subject of today's archaeology porn, Lucy, she is from another species called Afarensis, and that's part of the genus, which is Australopithecus. Now, fun pseudo fact, because a lot of this stuff is still contentious and in flux, we're not directly descended from Lucy. We're descended from another species within the Australopithecus genus. So Lucy isn't sort of like our mother. She's kind of like a second cousin or aunt by marriage. So we're not directly descended from her species. Now, the name Afarensis for that species, that's named, shares a name with Afar, which is a region in Ethiopia and Djibouti. And there's a people there called the Afar people. And let me tell you, this region is wild. It's full of some of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, something like from another planet. For example, the Danakil Depression is basically a bubbling, festering version of Mordor on Earth.
In the land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring to control all others.
And in nearby Djibouti, where I've been also, you can find poisonous, acidic, and saline lakes, a dead forest, and blackened earth, which is rent by volcanoes. So it's quite the holiday spot. Anyway, Lucy was found in 1974 in this region, but in a somewhat more hospitable part. But in any event, when she lived, it was more forested, a little bit more friendly for human habitation, although there weren't humans when she was found, not Homo sapiens, because she was found, she lived. She was found in 74. She lived 3.18 million years ago. So that is a very, very, very long time. Now, this puts Lucy at the very beginning of her species, Australopithecus Afarensis. Let's just call them AA. So this puts Lucy at the very beginning of AA's time on Earth, because they appeared about 3 million years ago. She's 3.18 million years old, so very beginning of their time. And they survived for 700,000 to 900,000 years on Earth, which actually makes them one of the longest surviving hominids in world history. And to give you an idea, that's more than twice as long as our species, Homo sapiens. So these guys were survivors too.
I'm a survivor. I'm not gonna give up. I'm not gonna stop. I'm gonna work harder.
What more can we say about these AAs? Well, first of all, they were very sexually dimorphous, much more so than humans. What does sexually dimorphous mean? It means there's a big difference between males and females. For example, males were typically about 1.7 meters tall, 5'7", just a bit shorter than I am, and they usually weighed about 64 kilos or about 151 pounds. Females, on the other hand, were usually just a meter tall, which is 3'3", and 25 kilos or 55 pounds, so much, much smaller than the men. Now, Lucy herself was a little tall. She was 1.1 meters or 3'7", and she weighed about 29 kilos, or I think that's about 64 pounds, something along those lines. So she was a little bit on the bigger side for females. Now, what else can we say about them? The wear patterns and isotopic evidence on their teeth suggests they ate mostly like shrubs, fruits, occasionally small animals like lizards. But over their very long time on Earth, they actually evolved, and it looks like they gained the ability to chew and eat more difficult to digest grasses that maybe modern humans wouldn't be eating. And I guess it makes sense because they had a harder life than we do. Now, like chimps, AAs grew up very quickly. They had a very short juvenile period, which makes sense because they didn't live that long. They lived only about 40 years, so you wouldn't want to have too long of a juvenile period where they can't mate. Kind of the opposite of us modern humans, where we grow up very slowly now, sort of forever youth. Based on her skeletal development, we know that Lucy lived till full maturity, so we're talking about legitimate porn here, and she wasn't a juvenile, but that she died young, shortly after she achieved adulthood. And her skeleton shows plenty of evidence of degenerative disease, like in her spine, which suggests she lived a difficult life. Not surprising, she was swinging around in the trees. And in fact, it's been argued that that's actually how she died. She has multiple fractures that are consistent with a fall, supposedly. And these occurred at a perimortem time. Perimortem means right around the time of death. These are perimortem injuries. Now, how do people know these would be perimortem injuries? basically bone specialists look at injuries and they could see the extent to which they healed or did not heal. If those happened right around death, they were perimortem. That's probably then something that has to do with the person's death. But this is a bit controversial. None of this is totally sealed yet. How do we know so much about Lucy? Well, that's because they found actually 40% of her skeleton approximately, which is great. In this time, there's hominin species where they only have a couple of bones. So 40% is quite a lot. And they were able to study those bones. And in fact, it was such a sensation because this was all so new. In fact, her species wasn't even named, the AA species, till 4 years after she was discovered. That was in 1978. So this caused quite a sensation. Now, I'm not aware of any bones from the AA species that are in the context of like any kind of habitation or, some area of really occupation. But they have found worked bone, worked stone in East Africa at that time. And I believe then her species, the AA species, would be the only candidates to have made that. Their range, by the way, was Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania. So East Africa we're talking about. That's where the AAs lived. Lucy's discovery almost 50 years ago in 1974 was made by Donald Johanson, a paleoanthropologist who is alive and well today at 80 years old and based out of Arizona State University. Now, one morning, he and his student, a graduate student by the name of Tom Gray, were out doing a survey of their research area, and they just decided by chance to go back a different way. And they spotted the bones, and the rest is history. Johansson's work was under the auspices of the International Afar Research Expedition, of which Mary Leakey, another paleoanthropologist, was also a part. Now, you may have heard of her. She was very famous and discovered one of the most famous sites from this time period called Olduvai Gorge in nearby Tanzania. They were all part of the same sort of research group. Now, at the time, Lucy was one of the most complete, as I mentioned, skeletons ever found of a hominin. So she was overnight an international archaeology porn star. It's important to remember that many of these early species survive just, as I said, in a few bones or bone fragments. So there's often vigorous debate about whether they really are unique species, how they relate to each other in an evolutionary sense, etc. Now, how did she get the name Lucy? Well, apparently during the excavation process that summer, they were just playing a song on the radio or a tape, which was by the Beatles, called Lucy with Diamonds in the Sky.
Lucy in the sky with diamonds.
So they called the remains Lucy, and the name just stuck. Nowadays, by the way, naming human remains is kind of a no-no, but this was almost 50 years ago, so fine. Now, the Ethiopians call her Dinkanesh, which means something like you are marvelous, and so that's how they refer to her. Today, you can see Lucy, as I did, in the National Museum in Ethiopia in Addis Ababa. The display is clear enough, but the exhibit and, in fact, the whole museum is a bit shabby. Multimedia and interactive displays are non-existent, and really the whole place could just use a fresh coat of paint. However, this is really not uncommon in a lot of developing and underdeveloped countries where they really have more pressing humanitarian needs than just sort of financing museums. So you can see a lot of old school museums of this type in places like Indonesia, Rwanda, Laos, other places that I've been. However, I was just a bit surprised because Lucy is so famous. I figured some NGO or foundation would step in to help, but alas, no. It's kind of sad because Ethiopia, as I've mentioned in the other segment, is such a proud country with a long history and fascinating culture that, what better way to instill pride among the people and get them jazzed up about their country than to showcase its history as really the cradle of human existence, the cradle of human life. But realistically, as I said, there are too many pressing problems in modern times. War, they had a war from 20 to 2022, basic subsistence and basic infrastructure development. So the museum will just need to wait. But you do also see this in some other countries that do have more resources and really should be putting more into their museums. Now, this all raises the issue of the treatment of human remains, because of course I'm considering Lucy alongside, other objects in the series like the Antikythera mechanism. But the fact of the matter is, Lucy was a person, maybe not a Homo sapien, but a living, breathing person. And the way we deal with human remains now has evolved, and it's quite different, and the language is different. So, as I mentioned, for example, before, on an archaeological site, we do not um, give the remains pet names. We can take pictures, but not post them all up on social media. And you may notice some changes in museums near you. Many museums will have a warning before people see human remains, because that's not something everyone's comfortable with. They are dead people. And how has the language evolved? You'll often hear human remains instead of skeletons. You'll often now see mummified human remains instead of mummies. You'll hear enslaved people instead of slaves. And this is all to remind us that they were human beings with agency, with feelings, with emotions and stories, just like ourselves, even if they lived a really long time ago. Now, personally, I'm really not a big fan of euphemisms and whitewashing, but I really do think this is a good thing. It reminds us that in studying ancient humans, we're looking into people's lives and humanizing them from a very long time ago. And, it may remind us that today there are people who are very far away from us, who we don't understand, people not so far away from us who we really don't like. And what we tend to do in those situations is dehumanize the people. And if we can humanize a gal who lived 3.18 million years ago, we can probably understand someone alive today. So that's my little pitch for what I think one of the main, contributions of archaeology is in today's world. Likewise, the enslaved people, for example, who worked all over the world for most of human history, they were not the nameless, faceless slaves that their owners thought them to be. They were enslaved people with feelings, emotions, and their own personal histories. So, what does this all mean for archaeology? Well, it's complicated. 1990 was a big watershed year in the United States because of the passage of something called NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, which gave Native American tribes a lot more say and agency in what happens to the remains that are found. So definitely score one for minority rights and humanity, but there are legitimate concerns about what this means for science. And likewise, you see a lot of things in the international realm as well, in Australia and elsewhere, and internationally, with the rights. There was in 2007, the UN passed the Rights of Indigenous People, which part of it has to do with remains and cultural artifacts. But anyway, this also has led, as I've alluded to big changes on archaeological sites. There's special protocols and ways of handling human remains now that are, justified, but definitely add cost and complexity to a discipline that's quite strapped for cash already. Anyway, we're still figuring all this out, and the compromises are messy. How old does someone have to be? How old do human remains have to be before, we're comfortable with putting them in a glass case? They sort of they're losing their humanity. There's no really good answers. When does grandma just become human remains that you can display? But with that being said, I don't think there's much controversy around Lucy at almost 3.2 million years old and having been displayed for a long time already. She's going to remain where she is. And I would encourage you to go see her, and to remember her humanity, that she was a person with feelings, because the exhibition that you're going to see doesn't do that part much justice. But go with an open mind. Also, while Lucy is definitely deserving of her international archaeology porn star status, and I definitely encourage you to pay her a visit, the exhibit is also symptomatic of a larger problem you unfortunately find in a lot of African countries, which is, if you go into their museums, these are museums that were generally started by either colonial powers or in Ethiopia's case, because it actually was never colonized, still under the tutelage of Europeans. And what you'll find in a lot of these museums is a lot of Paleolithic stuff, a lot of ethnographic stuff, and a lot of sort of ecological, environmental stuff. And basically, the implication of that is all this important stuff that happened in Africa is really long time ago. We sort of study these tribal people kind of the way we would study animals. And, nothing important happened there in the last 1,000 years, nothing worth learning. And that is kind of a problem. And you see that in a lot of these, colonial era museums all over Africa. So I think there is more sensitivity being paid to that now. And hopefully some of these museums are beginning to get upgrades, which will include a fuller vision of the history and, peoples of these countries and the really cultural richness that they do contain within them. Again, with this particular museum, the National Museum of Ethiopia, what I'm assuming, I don't know this for sure, so someone fact check me. I'm assuming this museum was founded under foreign tutelage. Addis Ababa was chock full, or still is chock full of an international community. There's a lot of international organizations there, like the African Union headquarters. And this particular museum being founded in the 1970s, that might have been under the Derg regime, the communist regime, which, was very heavily influenced and supported by the Soviet Union. So perhaps this is, sort of the product of Soviet workmanship, and that would make sense because of the very brutalist kind of architecture of the facility itself. And because that was sort of the bad old days of museum world, obviously this museum, even if when it was better funded and in better shape, wouldn't have done justice to the richness of the history and diversity of this wonderful and incredible country. All I really remember, other than the Lucy exhibit, was some stuff from the imperial family. Now, I was there about 10 years ago, so maybe the museum has seen an update, which would be great. And hopefully by the time you get there, it will be updated and shiny and new and have a more fuller collection that showcases the whole country, because Ethiopia is one you will want to visit. So that's another episode of Archaeology Porn. And, I bet little did this 3.2 million year old, 3'7" tall hot mama know that one day she would be an international archaeology porn star. And quite frankly, that is not something you see every day, even in the world of the internet, where you can find pretty much anything you want. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.